The pack cast me out on a Thursday. I want to be precise about that because precision matters when you are telling the story of the worst thing that happened to you. And you do not want anyone to think you are exaggerating. Thursday, 3 in the afternoon. The snow had been falling since morning. Elder Croft read the ruling in the common room with the pack assembled, and his voice had the particular evenness of a man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was governance and not cruelty, which I suppose was the only way he could do it at all. The ruling was this: my mate had died without registering our bond with the pack council. The registration had been planned for the winter ceremony. We had been going to do it together. He had died 6 months before the winter ceremony. Therefore, in the eyes of the pack charter, we had never been formally mated. Therefore, our child had no pack claim. Therefore, the pack was not obligated to extend resources to a child without claim. I held Fen through the whole reading. He was asleep. 3 months old and asleep against my chest, with his small fist against my collarbone, and his completely unfair eyelashes against his cheek. And he did not know that a room full of people had just decided he was not their problem. I looked at Elder Croft. I said, "My mate is dead and his child is 3 months old and it is snowing." Croft said, "You have 3 days." I said, "I will be gone by morning." I did not say it for drama. I said it because waiting 3 days felt like accepting the ruling on the terms of the person who had made it, and I would not do that. I left that night. I took Fen and my pack and the warmest things I owned, and I walked into the snow because staying was not something I was capable of. I made it 4 miles. The snow had other ideas about what happened next. And then the Alpha King's wolves found my trail. My name is Sansa. Welcome to Sansa Romance Oracle. This is the story of a pack that cast out a mother and her baby in a snowstorm. A king who found them. And what happened after, which was not what I expected and was better than anything I had a right to hope for. This story is completely original and exists only on this channel. Prologue 4 miles was not nothing. I want to say that clearly because I think sometimes when people tell stories about being found in difficult circumstances, the finding becomes the whole point and the getting there disappears. I had walked 4 miles in a snowstorm at night with a 3-month-old strapped against my chest, which was not nothing. The snow had been manageable for the first 2 miles. The 3rd mile it had started to mean it. I had a route in my head. The southern trading road was 6 miles out, and once I reached it there was a way station at the 8-mile marker that took travelers without asking questions. I had made it to that way station once before, 3 years ago, in better circumstances. I knew it was real. I was heading for a real thing. I was telling myself this on the 4th mile when Fen woke up. He did not cry immediately. He was a baby who woke in stages. First the small sounds, then the orientation, then the decision about whether circumstances warranted the full response. In the dark and the cold and the snow he oriented, assessed, and decided that circumstances absolutely warranted it. He started crying. It was not a distress cry. It was a hunger cry. I knew the difference. I had spent 3 months learning the difference. But it was loud and it was real, and it cut through the snow and the wind. And it was the most important sound I had ever heard, because it meant he was still fighting, and so was I. I stopped walking. I could not feed him while walking in those conditions. I needed shelter, and I had 4 miles of open road behind me, and no shelter in front of me that I could see. I sat down at the base of a large pine tree and pulled my coat around us both, and I started doing the thing I had been doing since Croft read the ruling in the common room. I was not crying. I was not panicking. I was working out what was actually available to me and what I was going to do with it. What was available to me: a pine tree, a coat, a baby who was hungry and alive, and the certainty that I was not going to let the cold win tonight. What I was going to do: feed him, keep him warm, wait for the worst of the wind to shift, keep moving. I was working through this with complete focus when the wolves appeared. 3 of them, very large, out of the dark on my left. They were not coldfin wolves. They were something else entirely. They sat down in the snow, approximately 10 feet from me, and looked at me with the focused attention of animals that had been sent to find something specific and had found it, and were now waiting for the next instruction. I looked at them. I said, "I am not going back to Coldfen." The largest one tilted its head. I said, "I have not done anything wrong. I have a baby and I am in a snowstorm, and I am going to the Southern Way station. I am not a threat." The wolf looked at me. Then it looked at something behind me. I turned. A man was coming through the trees. Chapter 1. The Alpha King in the Snow. He was larger than the trees made him look. Or perhaps the trees simply had no frame of reference for someone like him. He moved through the snow the way his wolves moved, without effort, without the particular struggle that the snow was imposing on me, with the ease of someone to whom this kind of terrain was simply the world. He stopped 10 feet away. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, "Are you hurt?" I said, "No." He said, "The child." I said, "Hungry." "Not hurt." He said, "How long have you been out here?" I said, "Long enough." He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "The Southern Way station." He said, "That is 4 miles. I said, "I am aware." He looked at me for a moment with the look of someone who was taking in considerably more information than the conversation contained. He said, "You came from Coldfen." It was not a question. He had read something. The direction I had come from, the pack markers I was still carrying in my scent, something. "Yes," he said. "Tonight." I said, 3 hours ago." He said, "In this storm." I said, "Correct." He said, "Why?" I looked at him. He looked back. He had dark hair, snow-dusted. A face that was controlled without being cold. There was a difference, and he was on the correct side of it. Eyes that were assessing me the way I had assessed the wolves, with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. I said, "The elder cast me out." He said, "On what grounds?" I said, "My mate died before he registered our bond. The child has no pack claim without the registration. The elder ruled we were a burden." He said, "Nothing." I said, "I left tonight because waiting 3 days felt like accepting it." He said, "Still nothing." He was looking at Fen now, at the small shape against my chest, the sounds Fen was making that had moved from hungry to patient in the way he moved between states when he decided I was doing my best. He said, "How old?" I said, 3 months. He said, "Come with me." I said, "Where?" He said, "My camp is a mile north. It is warm and I have a healer, and your child needs to eat somewhere that is not a snowstorm." I said, "I am not going back to Coldfen." He said, "I did not say Coldfen. I said my camp." He looked at me. He said, "My name is Aldrich Vane." I stared at him. He said, "Yes, that Vane. Come with me." I said, "You are the Alpha King." He said, "I am the Alpha King who is standing in a snowstorm asking a woman with a 3-month-old to come somewhere warm." He paused. "I am going to keep asking until you say yes." I looked at the snow. I looked at the wolves. I looked at Fen. I said, "All right." He said, "Good." He held out his hand. I took it. He walked me through the snow to the camp, and his hand was warm and steady, and I held on more tightly than was strictly necessary because the relief of someone else being there was larger than I had expected, and I was not going to examine that. I was going to get Fen fed and warm. Everything else after. Chapter 2. The camp. The camp was a traveling party of perhaps 30 people, soldiers, advisors, a small support staff for an inspection tour of the Southern Territories. It was warm and organized, and when we arrived, the specific efficiency of a well-run camp arranged itself around us without fuss. A healer appeared. A fire was made larger. Food I had not asked for appeared beside the fire within 10 minutes. The healer was a small woman who examined Fen with the thoroughness of someone who was good at her work and was not going to perform reassurance she had not yet earned. She said, "He is cold but not dangerously. He is hungry. He is otherwise healthy." She looked at me. She said, "You did well getting him here." I said, "I was going to the way station." She said, "You would have made it." She paused. "This is warmer." I fed Fen by the fire. He ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had made a decision that circumstances had improved and was acting accordingly. He looked at the fire while he ate with the dark eyes that were his father's eyes and the expression of complete contentment of someone whose needs were being met. I looked at the fire. I thought about Coldfin. I thought about a common room and a ruling in the snow and 4 miles, and the wolves appearing in the dark, and a king holding out his hand. I thought about Fen named for the pack that cast him out. I thought, they do not deserve the name. I am going to keep it anyway. It is ours now. Aldrich appeared at the edge of the fire. He sat at a respectful distance. Not so far that it was performance. Not so close that it required anything of me. He said, "Do you want to tell me the full account?" I said, "Tonight." He said, "Whenever you are ready." I looked at Fen. I said, "My mate was Bren Coldfen. We mated 8 months ago. He died in a border skirmish 6 months ago. I was 2 weeks pregnant when he died. We had been planning to register the bond at the winter ceremony," Aldrich said. "He died before the registration." I said, "Yes." He said, "And the elder ruled the child had no claim." I said, "Correct." He said, "What is your name?" I said, "Nara." He said, "And his?" I said, "Fen." He said, "Fen Coldfen." I said, "Fen." "Just Fen for now." He looked at the fire. He said, "The Coldfen pack is in my territory." I said, "I know." He said, "The elder's ruling falls under my jurisdiction." I said, "I know that too." He said, "I am going to look at the charter." I said, "What?" He said, "The pack charter. The mating registration requirements. I am going to look at them tonight, because what you have described sounds like it may not be what the charter actually says." I looked at him. He said, "I do not want to promise you anything until I have read the document. But what you are describing, a registered mate who died before formal registration of a child, is not a standard ruling. The charter has provisions for exactly that circumstance." I said, "Why did Croft?" He said, "That is what I want to find out." He stood up. He said, "Sleep. You are safe here. I will have answers in the morning." He left. I sat by the fire with Fen, who had fallen asleep against my chest, again with his unfair eyelashes and his complete trust in me. And I thought about a charter and provisions, and an elder who had read a document and reached a conclusion the document might not support. I thought about what that meant. I held Fen and looked at the fire and let myself, for the first time since Thursday afternoon, feel something that was not cold. I felt angry, not the cold-managed kind I had been carrying since the ruling, the real kind. The hot, specific kind that comes when you understand that the wrong thing was not just wrong, but was also possibly deliberate. I held Fen and I was angry, and the fire was warm and I was alive. We were both alive. That was the beginning. Chapter 3. What the charter said. He was at the fire before I was. I woke at dawn to Fen's morning sounds and came out of the tent they had given me to find Aldrich at the campfire, with a document spread across his knee and the expression of a man who had been reading for several hours and had arrived at a conclusion he had not wanted to arrive at. He looked up. He said, "Good morning." I said, "The charter." He said, "Yes." I said, "What does it say?" He looked at the document. He said, "The charter has 3 provisions for the circumstance of a mating partner who dies before formal registration." He looked at me. He said, "The first provision, if both partners have declared the mating bond verbally before pack witnesses, the bond is considered valid regardless of formal registration." I said, "There were witnesses. The entire pack dining room the night Bren told them." He said, "I thought so." He looked back at the document. The second provision. A child born within 12 months of a declared mating bond inherits full pack claim regardless of the registration status of the bond at the time of the birth. I said nothing. He said, "The third provision, the elder has no authority to rule on mating bond validity without a full council vote. A unilateral ruling by a single elder on a matter of bond and claim is not valid under the charter." The campfire burned. Fen made a small sound. I said, "Carefully." He made the ruling alone. Aldrich said, "Yes." I said, "Without the council." He said, "Yes." I said, "And the ruling was against provisions that clearly covered my situation." He said, "Yes." He looked at me. He said, "I do not want to speculate about why until I have spoken to Croft directly. But what I can tell you now is that the ruling was not valid. Your child has full pack claim under the Coldfin Charter, and you have the right to return if you choose." I said, "I do not choose." He said, "I know. I am telling you because you should know you were not what he said you were." I looked at the fire. I said, "What happens to Croft?" He said, "That depends on what he tells me. He will tell me today. I am sending a rider to Coldfen this morning." He said, "What do you want to happen?" I looked at him. He said, "You have standing in this. You are the wronged party. I am asking what you want." No one had asked me what I wanted since Thursday. I said, "I want it on the record." What he did. Not quietly resolved. On the pack record where it will not disappear. He said, "Yes." I said, "And I want the pack to know they were wrong. Not just Croft. The pack who stood in that room and said nothing." He said, "I understand." I said, "They are not bad people. I know most of them. They were afraid of Croft, and they said nothing, and a woman and a 3-month-old walked into a snowstorm." He said, "Yes." I said, "They should know what their silence cost." He said, They will know. He looked at the document. He said, Nara. I said, yes. He said, what do you want to do after? After the accounting with Cold Fin. What do you want? I looked at Fen. I said, I do not know yet. He said, that is a reasonable answer. I said, I have been managing hours, not futures. He said, I know. He said, you can take as long as you need to get to futures. He said it simply. You are not going anywhere today, and you are not going anywhere tomorrow. You and Fen are here, and you are safe, and the rest can wait. I looked at him. He looked back. He was the alpha king of the entire territory, and he was sitting at a campfire in the snow telling me I could take as long as I needed, and he meant it. I said, thank you. He said, do not thank me yet. He almost smiled. You have not met Lenna. I said, who is Lenna? He said, my daughter. She is at the palace. She is 8 years old, and she has been telling me for 3 years that I need to find someone, and I have been telling her it is not that simple. I said, is it? He said, she is about to tell me it is. He looked at the fire. I looked at him. I said, how old? He said, 8. She is fierce and she is kind, and she has opinions about everything. I said, that sounds like a lot. He said, it is exactly a lot. He looked at me. She is the best thing I have ever done. I thought about Fen against my chest. I said, yes. I said it quietly. He looked at me. I looked at the fire. We sat at the campfire in the snow, and the morning came up cold and clear, and neither of us said anything else, and it was the most comfortable silence I had been in since Thursday. Chapter 4, Cold Fen. Croft came to the camp. Aldrich had sent the rider with the specific instruction that the elder present himself, which was not a request. Croft had arrived 2 hours later with the particular expression of a man who had been expecting this and had prepared his position. He had not prepared sufficiently. Aldrich sat at the camp table with the charter open. I sat to his left. Croft looked at me. He said, you went to the Alpha King. I said, he found me in the snow, 4 miles from Cold Fen, with a 3-month-old. Croft said, you left voluntarily. I said, I left because you gave me 3 days, and waiting felt like accepting a ruling that was wrong. He said, the ruling was within my authority. Aldrich said no. Croft looked at him. Aldrich said, it was not. He placed the charter on the table and turned it to face Croft. Provision 7. Provision 9. Provision 12. He said each one without heat. 3 separate provisions that cover this exact circumstance. The child has full claim. The bond was valid. Your ruling required a council vote you did not take, Croft said. The charter allows elder discretion in matters of. Aldrich said no. Read Provision 4. Elder discretion applies to territorial disputes and resource allocation. Not to bond validity. Not to child claims. Never to child claims. Croft looked at the document. He said, I interpreted the provision as. Aldrich said, you interpreted it incorrectly, or you interpreted it in a way you found convenient. He said it flatly. I am going to need to understand which. Croft was quiet. I looked at him. I thought about a common room on Thursday, and his voice reading the ruling and Fen asleep against my chest. I said, why? He looked at me. I said, I am asking you directly. Why? Bren was dead. I was not asking for anything extraordinary. The charter covered us. Why did you rule the way you ruled? Croft said. The pack's resources, I said, are not in deficit. The pack is stable. You know that. He said, a child without a registered father, I said, has a registered mother. Me, who has been a contributing pack member for 6 years. That is also in the charter. He said nothing. I said, why, Croft? He looked at the table. He said, quietly, Bren's family did not want the child recognized. The camp was very still. I said, Bren's family. He said, his parents. They did not want to acknowledge a child Bren had not formally registered. They felt it complicated the inheritance of his pack land. I looked at him. I said, they asked you to rule against us. He said, they expressed their preferences. I said, and you ruled accordingly. He said, I used my discretion. I said, you used your discretion to put a woman and a baby in a snowstorm on behalf of a family that wanted to keep the land. He said nothing. Aldrich said, you will step down from the elder position today. The ruling against Nara and her child will be formally reversed and placed on the pack record with a full account of the grounds. The Coldfin Pack Council will be convened within the week. He looked at Croft, and Bren's family will have no claim against the child. None. That will also be on the record. Croft said, the pack will. Aldrich said, the pack will do what the charter requires. As it should have done on Thursday. Croft left. I sat at the camp table and looked at the charter. I thought about Bren's family. I had known them. They had come to the mating. They had been warm enough, in the way people were warm when warmth was the correct performance. They had asked Croft to rule against us. For the land. I sat with this for a long time. Aldrich did not rush me. Eventually I said, I am not going back to Coldfen. He said, I know. I said, even with the ruling reversed. Even with the record. He said, you do not have to. I said, it is not my home anymore. He said, no. He said it simply. Where do you want to go? I looked at Fen. I said, I do not know yet. He said, you said that this morning. I said, it is still true. He said, then stay here until you know. I looked at him. He looked back. He said, the inspection tour continues for 4 more days. After that I go back to the palace. He paused. You can come to the palace. There is room and Fen would be warm and Lenna would. He stopped. He said, Lenna would have a great many opinions about Fen. I said, how many opinions? He said, considerable. She has been wanting a younger sibling for 3 years. She has made this clear. I said, Fen is 3 months old. He said, she is not specific about age requirements. I looked at the fire. I thought about a palace and warmth and a fierce kind 8-year-old with opinions about younger siblings. I thought about the way he sat at a campfire in the snow and told me I had time. I said, 4 more days? He said, yes. I said, and then I will decide. He said, yes. He was going to say something else. He did not say it. But I heard it anyway, in the way you heard things that had not been said yet, but were building toward being said. I was not ready to respond to it. I was going to need the 4 days. I was going to need them for more than one decision. Chapter 5, 4 days. The 4 days were not what I expected. I had expected to be managed. To be placed somewhere sensible and checked on at intervals while the inspection tour continued around me. I had expected the particular courtesy of a man who had done the right thing and was now resuming his actual work. He included me in the actual work. Not formally. Not as a participant with standing. Simply as a person who was there and who he talked to in the evenings when the day's business was done. He told me what the inspection had found. I told him what I knew of the settlements they were passing through because I had lived in this region for 6 years and knew the people and the history in ways his formal reports did not. He listened. He asked questions. On the second day, he said, "You know the Marsh family in the Eastern Settlement?" I said, "Yes. 3 generations. Good people. Their land dispute with the Vane Eastern office has been running for 4 years." He said, "Tell me the dispute." I told him. He said, "The Eastern office has been citing the wrong boundary markers. The original survey," I said, "was conducted before the flood of 12 years ago, which shifted the river. The Marsh family has the original survey and the flood records. The Eastern office has been ignoring the flood records." He said, "How do you know this?" I said, "Because I sat with old Marta Marsh for 2 hours last spring when she could not sleep, and she told me everything about the dispute in considerable detail." He said, "Can you remember the details?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me." I told him. He sent a different message to the Eastern office the following morning. On the third day, he said, "You should be doing something with this." I said, "With what?" He said, "This." He gestured between us and the conversation we had been having. "You know these settlements. You know the people and the history and the disputes and what the official records are missing." I said, "I was a mid-rank pack member." He said, "Pack rank is not the only way to measure what someone knows." I said, "What are you suggesting?" He said, "Nothing yet." He said it simply. "I am observing." I looked at him. He looked at the road ahead. I said, "You are not as straightforward as you appear." He said, "I am exactly as straightforward as I appear. I am simply also interested in what is in front of me." I said, "What is in front of you?" He said, "You." He said it the way he said most things. Directly, without performance as simple fact. I looked at the road. I said, "I am not." He said, "I know. I am not asking for anything. I am telling you what I see." I said, "You see someone who walked 4 miles in a snowstorm." He said, "I see someone who walked 4 miles in a snowstorm and kept her baby warm and named him for the pack that cast her out because she decided if they were going to take everything, they would not take that too." He paused. "I see someone who sat across from an elder in a camp and demanded the real answer and got it. I see someone who knows the Marsh family's land dispute in enough detail to correct a 4-year error." He looked at me. He said, "That is what I see." I said nothing. I looked at the road. The 4th day came. In the morning, Fen did the thing he had been doing for 2 weeks that still undid me every time. He looked at my face while I was talking to someone else, and then he smiled. Not a reflex smile, a recognition smile. The smile of someone who had found his person and was satisfied about it. I looked at him. He smiled again. I said, very quietly, "You are everything." He reached up and grabbed my hair. He was satisfied. I laughed. Aldrich was at the fire. He was watching me laugh. I caught him watching. He did not look away. I said, 4 days are up." He said, "Yes." I said, "I have made my decision." He said, "Tell me." I said, "I will come to the palace." He said, "Yes." I said, "Not because I do not have other options. I have other options." He said, "I know." I said, "Because Fen deserves warmth and stability, and because I am curious about the work, and because—" I stopped. He waited. I said, "Because you sat at a campfire in a snowstorm and told me I had time and you meant it. And I have not had someone mean that to me in a long time." He said, "I meant it." I said, "I know." He said, "Nara." I said, "Yes." He said, I am glad the wolves found your trail. I looked at him. I said, so am I. He held out his hand. I took it. We rode toward the palace, and Fen slept against my chest, and the snow had stopped, and the road was clear, and I thought about futures for the first time since Thursday. They did not frighten me. They had not started yet. I was looking forward to them. 2. Chapter 6. Lenna. Lenna was waiting at the palace gate. She had been informed. Aldrich told me that they were returning from the inspection tour. She had not been informed about me. He had decided to let that arrive in person rather than in a message, which I understood as either wisdom or mild cowardice, and suspected was some of both. She was 8 years old, and she was standing at the gate in her coat, with her dark hair in a braid that had come half undone, and an expression of someone who had been waiting and was now taking rapid inventory of what had arrived. She looked at Aldrich. She looked at me. She looked at Fen. Her expression changed. I had seen this before, on Willa's face in Story 9, on Iris's face in Story 8, on every child who had decided something with the completeness that only children could bring to decisions. She decided. She walked directly to me. She said, "Can I hold him?" I said, "He is 3 months old." "You have to support his head," she said. "I know how to support a head. I have been reading about it." I looked at Aldrich. He looked at the sky. I transferred Fen into Lenna's arms with the care of someone handing over something irreplaceable. She held him with the specific competence of someone who had in fact been reading about it. Fen looked up at her. She looked down at him. She said, "Hello, Fen." He reached up. He grabbed her braid. She said, "He is strong." I said, "Yes." She said, "He has good eyes." I said, "He does." She looked at me. She said, "What happened to you?" I said, "The pack cast me out." She said, "Because of Fen." I said, "Because of a charter ruling that was wrong." She said, "Papa fixed it?" I said, "Papa fixed it." She said, "Good." She looked at Fen. She said, "You are going to stay here." She said it not as a question, as a statement of the way things were going to be. I said, "For a while." She said, "More than a while." I said, "We will see." She looked at Aldrich. She said, "Papa." He said, "Lenna." She said, "She should stay more than a while." He said, "That is not my decision alone." She said, "I know." She looked at me. I am asking her. I looked at this 8-year-old holding my son at the palace gate. I said, "Let's go inside. It is cold." She said, "Is that a yes?" I said, "It is a let's go inside and get Fen warm, and then we will talk about the rest." She said, "I can work with that." She walked inside carrying Fen with the focused care of someone who had appointed herself, and took the appointment seriously. I stood at the gate. Aldrich stood beside me. I said, "She is extraordinary." He said, "I know." I said, "She decided in about 30 seconds. He said, "She has been deciding for 3 years. She was just waiting for the right thing to arrive." I looked at him. He looked at me. He said, "So was I." I said, "That is more than I was expecting you to say." He said, "I have been practicing being direct. 3 years of Lenna helps." I said, "She is a good teacher." He said, "The best I have had." We went inside. Fen was already getting the full tour from Lenna, who was explaining the palace to him with the thoroughness of an 8-year-old who had lived there her whole life and had opinions about every room. Fen was listening, or appearing to listen. I suspected he was mostly looking at her braid. Either way, he seemed satisfied. So did she. Chapter 7. What staying looked like. I stayed. not because I had no other options. I want to be clear about that, because I was clear about it to myself at every point. I stayed because it was the right place, and because the work was real, and because Fen was warm, and because Lenna had decided we were hers within 30 seconds and had not wavered from this in 3 months, and because Aldrich sat at Palace table in the evenings and told me what was in the reports, and listened when I told him what the reports were missing, and looked at me like I was. Work to me what the report is was working. That last one was the one I had not expected. I had expected to be managed kindly. I had not expected to be seen. 3 months in the palace. Fen had grown the way 3-month-olds grew when they were warm and well, fed and held by everyone who passed, with the specific contentment of someone who had decided the world was a good place and intended to enjoy it fully. He was 6 months old now, and he had decided that pulling Lenna's braid was the funniest thing available to him. And Lenna had decided this was acceptable and wore her braid loose around him, so he had better access, which I found so specifically kind that I had to look at a wall for a moment the first time I noticed. I had started working. Not formally, not with a title. Simply as a person who knew things and said them and was listened to. The Eastern Office and the Marsh family land dispute had been resolved in 6 weeks. I had been part of 3 other settlement conversations by month 2. In month 3, Aldrich had said, "I want to make this a position." I had said, "What kind of position?" He had said, "Settlement liaison. Someone who knows the region and the people and can sit between the official channels and the actual situation." I had said, "That is a real need." He said, "I know. I should have had someone doing it for years." I said, "You have had people. They just did not know what I know." He said, "Yes." I said, "Why me?" He said, "Because you know what the Marsh family knows, and you know how Marta tells it, and you know the difference between the official record and the actual situation." He paused. "And because you are not afraid of telling me when I am wrong." I said, "You have not been wrong yet." He said, "I will be. I want you to tell me when it happens." I said, "I can do that." He said, "I know." He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, "Nara." I said, "Yes." He said, "I have been not saying something for 3 months." I said, "I know." He said, "I was giving you time." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you still need it?" I looked at him. I thought about Thursday, about the common room, and the ruling and the snow and 4 miles, and his hand in the dark. I thought about 3 months of mornings where Fen woke, and the palace was warm, and Lenna appeared within minutes, and the day began. I thought about evenings at the table and reports, and the Marsh family and a man who looked at me like I was worth looking at. I said, "No." He said, "No, you do not need more time." I said, "No, I do not need more time." He said, "Nara." I said, "Yes." He said, "I found you in the snow with a 3-month-old and a pack that had failed you, and I have spent 3 months watching you build something from that, and I am entirely certain about what I want to say." I said, "Say it." He said, "I want this to be real, not careful and managed and at a diplomatic distance." "Real." I said, "It is already real." He said, "More real." I said, "How much more?" He said, "All of it." He held my gaze. "I want all of it if you want all of it." I looked at him. I thought about all of it. I said, "I walked into a snowstorm with a 3-month-old because I would not accept a wrong ruling." He said, "Yes." I said, "That is who I am." He said, "I know." It is why I want all of it. I said, I am going to tell you when you are wrong. He said, I know. I asked for that specifically. I said, I am going to keep the work. He said, I created the position. I said, Fen is going to have Cold Fen in his name. He said, Cold Fen is in my territory. I can think of no better place for the name to land. I looked at him. He looked back. I said, all right. He said, all right, you want all of it. I said, all right, I want all of it. He reached across the table. He put his hand over mine. I turned my hand over. He held on. From the corridor, with the specific timing of a child who had been listening at the door for an indeterminate amount of time, Lenna said, finally. Then the sound of her running away down the corridor at speed. Then silence. Then Fen's voice from the nursery, cheerful and unrelated to anything, simply announcing his presence. I looked at the corridor. I looked at Aldrich. He was looking at the corridor with the expression he used for Lenna, the one that was helpless and fond and entirely surrendered. I said she was listening. He said, she is always listening. I said, she is 8 years old. He said, she is very good at it. I said, how long do you think she has been waiting at that door? He said, based on her timing, approximately the entire conversation. I looked at the corridor. I said, she is extraordinary. He said, she found you in the snow. Technically. He paused. She told me about you before I came home. I said, what? He said, she said, Papa, the inspection tour is going to find something important. I did not know what she meant. I said, she told you before you left. He said, she said, go carefully. There is someone who needs finding. I stared at him. He said, she is 8 years old. I said, she is 8 years old and she knew. He said, she always knows. From the corridor, distant now, Lenna's voice. She said, I told you so. She said it to no one in particular. She said it to the palace. She said it because she had been right, and she was not going to let that pass without noting it. She was absolutely right. She had always been right. She had just been waiting for us to get there. Epilogue. What Fen knew. 1 year later. Fen was 15 months old. He was walking. He had been walking since 11 months, which the palace healer said was early, and which Lenna said was because he was trying to keep up with her, and which I said was because he had decided, and once Fen decided something, it happened. He walked through the palace with the focused purpose of someone who had locations to reach and things to examine when he reached them. He had a particular fondness for the garden, which had a bird feeder that the head gardener had installed because Fen had stood at the garden window for 3 consecutive mornings, looking at the birds with an expression that had convinced the gardener that a bird feeder was the correct response. The gardener was not wrong. Fen examined the birds every morning. Lenna accompanied him on the bird examination most mornings because she had decided the examination required a second opinion, and her opinion was valuable. She was 9 now. She had not changed in the ways that mattered. She was still fierce and kind and certain, and she still held Fen with the competence of someone who had read about it and practiced and taken the appointment seriously. She was also, in the past year, teaching him things. Small things, the birds' names, the garden plants, the specific path through the east corridor that avoided the draughty section, the way the kitchen staff preferred to be greeted in the morning. He absorbed everything. He had his father's dark eyes and my gray eyes, and the particular quality of someone who was building a map of the world with full attention and intended to use it. He was 15 months old, and he was already learning who he was. I watched him from the doorway of the garden. Aldrich came to stand beside me. He said, "Lenna is teaching him the birds again." I said, "He already knows the birds." He said, "She thinks he needs the Latin names." I said, "He is 15 months old." He said, "She feels it is never too early." I looked at my son in the garden with his sister, who was not his sister, and the birds and the morning light. I said, "Aldrich." He said, "Yes." I said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." I said, "I named him Fen because I decided if the pack was going to take everything from me, they would not take that too." He said, "I know." I said, "I want to add something to the name." He looked at me. I said, "Not Coldfin. He can keep Coldfin if he wants it when he is old enough to decide. I want to add Vane." He was very still. I said, "He is part of this. He is part of what you and Lenna built here and what we have built together. He should have the name." He said, "Nara," I said. He said, "Yes." He said it before I finished. "Yes." He looked at the garden. "Yes to everything you are asking." I said, "I am going to need you to be more specific." He said, "Fen, Coldfen, Vane. And whatever you need after that." He turned to look at me. "All of it." "I told you all of it a year ago." I said, "I know." He said, "It has not changed." I said, "I know." He said, "Has yours?" I looked at the garden. I thought about Thursday, about the snow and the ruling and 4 miles, and his hand in the dark. I thought about a year of mornings and evenings, and the Marsh family and Lenna, and a bird feeder installed, because a 15-month-old had stood at a window with intent. I thought about all of it. I said, "Mine is bigger than it was." He said, "Good." He took my hand. In the garden, Lenna had finished the Latin names. Fen had listened to all of them. He looked at the bird feeder. He looked at Lenna. He pointed at the largest bird and said, with the absolute certainty of a 15-month-old who had been paying attention, his own version of the name Lenna had just taught him. He was not quite right. He was very close. Lenna said, almost. "Try again." He tried again. "Closer," she said. "Good. Keep going." He kept going. He was learning. He had time. He was going to get it exactly right. He always did, in the end. That is the end of the pack rejected her baby. The Alpha King found them both in the snow. If the moment Lenna held Fen at the palace gate and said, "You are going to stay here," and she already knew. If that broke you open, you are exactly the person I make these stories for. More stories are on this channel, all completely original, all made only here. My name is Sansa. I will see you for the next one.